In his classic theoretical essay, What is an Author?, Foucault is interested in figuring out the relationship between four etymologically related concepts: authorship, authorization, authority, and authenticity. In this video, I will attempt to clarify or illustrate some of his key arguments using the example of Batman. At first, this may seem like an odd choice because there are multiple iterations of Batman across a wide variety of media platforms, and hence there is no single Batman author. But this multi-author situation is exactly what makes Batman so useful for illustrating several of Foucault's theses about how different ideas of authorship function in different ways. Consider, for example, Foucault's complication of Roland Barthes' argument that the author is not the limit of meaning, which can be found in the second two paragraphs of page 1397 of the PDF. Foucault appears to agree with Barthes that we should focus on the structures of a work rather than attempt to reconstitute an author's thought and experience. But he then adds that if we are willing to question the value of the concept of authorship as a guarantee of meaning, we should be equally skeptical about the idea of a work. What falls in or outside of a canon of authorial works becomes a fresh problem if you are going to declare the author a dead concept. And even if you decide that the concept of the author remains useful, is everything attached to that authorial name a work? Does Nietzsche's laundry bill or the reminder of an appointment in the back of one of his notebooks count? Now, at first blush, this might sound like an exaggerated difficulty, a form of cheeky academic troublemaking that imagines a problem where really there is none. But let's think about it for a moment in relation to Batman. Let's say DC Comics decided to publish a library edition of the complete Batman comics. What gets included and what doesn't? For the first several years of his appearance, Batman appeared in an anthology title called Detective Comics. Original readers of this comic would therefore have encountered Batman as just one of an array of pulp-inspired action-adventure heroes. This is important contextual material that suggests something about the genre expectations of the audience, the politics and prejudices of action-adventure fantasies, and the affinities between superheroes and other genres such as the Western or spy story. For someone interested in thinking about Batman in a scholarly way, this could be said to be important and even vital information. There are very real interpretive consequences if we exclude these materials from our complete Batman comics library. And what about the advertising pages, letter pages, PSAs, and other paratexts? What do we make of the fact, for example, that first-time readers of Batman in 1939 saw this message when they opened the book on the inside front cover? A clearly didactic warning designed to make the audience more law-abiding by emphasizing the message that crime does not pay. This kind of paratext, as we would now call it, is at least arguably an integral part of the reading experience of the story that introduced Batman to the world. And then there were the ads that punctuated the comics throughout the stories. How does it change our experience of Batman, or indeed of any superhero, to read their texts in an ad-free context, or to encounter them as figures who are fully implicated in a commercial culture of consumption? We could, I suppose, argue for the exclusion of these various texts on the grounds that although they are an essential part of the context in which Batman was originally read, he doesn't appear within them. But what about Batman comics that were produced at the same time but not published in comic book form, such as the daily newspaper strip? Should these also be included in a complete Batman library? And then there are children's books that feature the character. And what about the novelizations from the movies? And so on. All these questions follow from Foucault's observation that the idea of the work is as historically contingent as the idea of the author. As Foucault says, plainly, we lack a theory to encompass the questions generated by a work, and the empirical activity of those who naively undertake the publication of the complete works of an author often suffers from the absence of this framework. Equally interesting is the way DC Comics has chosen to address this problem. The very first Batman story from Detective Comics 27, which you read for our first module, has been reprinted literally dozens of times. DC sometimes even markets this story as if it constitutes the entire contents of Detective Comics 27, but as you've seen, it does not. On other occasions, DC has gone to the trouble of producing more complete and accurate reprints, and when they do so, they are marketed very differently and priced accordingly. Besides helping us to see the difficulty of establishing the boundaries of a work, Batman can also help us to understand some of Foucault's subsequent arguments about how authorial names function, to use his wording at the top of page 1399. First, Foucault points out that the name of the author is complicated simply by the fact that it is a proper noun, and all proper nouns have more than a simple indicative function. They don't just point, they describe. Or as Foucault says, the proper name and the name of an author oscillate between the poles of description and designation. Yet, and it is here that the specific difficulties attending an author's name appear, the link between a proper name and the individual being named, and the link between an author's name and that which it names, are not isomorphous and do not function in the same way, and these differences require clarification. Foucault's phrasing here may also seem to require some clarification. It sounds terribly complicated, but he is really just trying to get at a relatively simple fact. The fact that an author's name works in the world in a way that an ordinary proper name does not. Foucault gives the example of Shakespeare and how his name would function differently if certain texts were added or subtracted to his canon. But an even better example might be the proper name that is usually evoked as Batman's first author or creator, Bob Kane. As you know from the first module of this section, Bob Kane's name was securely attached as sole author of the Batman property when the character debuted. But his claim was challenged by Bill Finger. And if you've watched the documentary I recommended back in Module 1, then you'll know that Bill Finger's claim has since been substantiated in court and is now attached to the property alongside Bob Kane's. This history can help us to see the difference between proper names and authorial names that Foucault is trying to draw out here. As a proper name, Bob Kane continues to refer to the actual historic person of Bob Kane. It still designates this particular man. But its descriptive function as the name of an author, the creator of Batman, has been profoundly altered. Having established the fairly obvious point that the authorial name does more than simply designate a particular person, but also attributes something to that person, Foucault finally begins to elaborate on the kind of work authorial names can do, to describe a few more author functions, as he terms them. As he notes, one author function can be to organize or discipline textual profusion by serving as a means of classification. That is to say, an authorial name can be used to group together a number of texts and thus differentiate them from others. By implying relationships among texts, the name of the author can also change the way we respond to the discourse to which it is attached. Or, as Foucault says, discourse that possesses an author's name is not to be immediately consumed and forgotten. Neither is it accorded the momentary attention given to ordinary, fleeting words. Rather, its status and its manner of reception are regulated by the culture in which it circulates. And the key point here is that one author function is to bestow a kind of status. We can again see this vividly with regard to the ways that authors' names do get attached to Batman when they are attached, despite the fact that the character has no single author. Many collections of Batman reprints do not name an author at all, but refer to some other organizing or classificatory principle. For example, Batman stories from a particular decade, or stories featuring favorite villains, or some other organizing theme. But this more expensive hardcover-only series, Tales of the Batman, makes a point of selecting works by particular writers or artists and grouping them together, sometimes regardless of continuity. For example, the Tales of the Batman Gene Colan collection, which is devoted to works by one of the more admired artists to work on this character, does not print complete stories. If Gene Colan didn't draw every episode of a particular storyline, this collection just skips over those issues. The presumption is that people buying this collection are not just interested in Batman, but in this particular author's version of Batman, in this case the work of an artist who is known for his efforts to bring motion to the page with his loose-limbed figure work, swirling costumes, abrupt alterations of perspective, and so on. Batman collections that have prominent authorial names on them are therefore distinguished from other kinds of Batman story, accorded a different status, and often a higher aesthetic value. On page 1400, Foucault suggests why this may be. The name of an author is a variable that accompanies only certain texts to the exclusion of others. A private letter may have a signatory, but it does not have an author. A contract can have an underwriter, but not an author. And similarly, an anonymous poster attached to a wall may have a writer, but he cannot be an author. In this sense, the function of an author is to characterize the existence, circulation, and operation of certain discourses within a society. That is to say, only certain discourses are enhanced by the author function, while others are deprived of it. Or, to put it even more simply, while a text may have a writer, that doesn't mean it has an author, at least in the sense that Foucault is trying to elaborate. So we now have three distinct author functions: to organize texts, in other words, to help us establish what a work actually is, to distinguish certain texts from one another, and to endow those texts with a special status. In the case of Batman, the name of an author both classifies and classes up the unruly extended canon of Bat texts. In the next video, we will look at the third and fourth sections of Foucault's essay to explore additional consequences of the author function, again using the example of Batman to illustrate and explain Foucault's ideas. I'll see you there.